Okay, good morning. We resume Hemshech Ayin Beis following this powerful Yom Tov and Simchas Torah. So, where are we here? The last class, what was our last class? Anybody remember?
Coffin on Vav.
Yeah, we're in the middle of page, I believe.
1156.
1156, right. 1156. Okay, so let's refresh and review. And we didn't move over to Tzadik Daled, that I remember. Yeah. So, to sum up, just to refresh myself, refresh you, we're middle of the subject matter within the theme of the interface of Ayin Beis, the central theme. Yesh Ayin Yesh, that everything in the entire cosmic order and above and beyond is three general levels. Yesh Amiti, which is the true and absolute reality of Atzmos. Yesh HaNivra, the created reality, our existence. And the Ayin Be'emtza, the interface in between, which in turn divides into two. One that relates more the Ayin Amiti to the Yesh Amiti, and the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. And that we learned three in different interpretations, what that means in different levels, which I'm not going to review right now. And now in this mimer, which began the bottom of page 1154, but essentially really from page 1155, he started Omna Mashakosov, Kael Deus Avaya, that these two deis, till now we were discussing is the perspective from above, meaning from Yesh Amiti as Atzmus looks at existence. So the Yesh Amiti, the true Yesh, is Lamaila, and everything beyond that, below it, is Ayin, completely meaningless, completely insignificant, I should say, like we learned. Yesh HaNivra, the perspective is the opposite. The Yesh HaNivra exists, and everything above it is a mystery, or Loi Dover, it's not a substance that we can relate to. Or it's Ein Musik, the two reasons why it's called Ayin. In this mimer, he says, however, from the fact that the Pasuk says in Deus Havaya, it's not Kael Deus in general. I'm not saying there's two perspectives. In Havaya, in godliness itself, there's two perspectives. So he says in Elikuz Gufa, Ayin Atzme, there's two Deus. And with that, he began a discussion explaining that's not just that the Atzmus sees the perspective one way and the existence sees it another way, from the bottom up, and that's from the top down. But in Ayin itself, the Oyer, that reflects the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, that Oyer itself senses itself as being in a state of, as he said, I'll just sum up what he said. The Oyer itself is in a state of Ayin. So the perspective from the Ayin of the first Ayin of the Yesh Amiti is that it is completely bottled, completely insignificant or nullified in the presence of Atzmus. And then he says, V'hine, ma'sha'eru b'chinas ayin, yesh lahovin b'kamei fanim be'inyan habitl. So this is vital because this is the beginning of the whole setting the tone. It says, now in this state of ayin, when you say that the earth feels bittul, the earth does not feel itself as an identity of its own, but only an extension of, an expression of its source. He says, in that itself, there's kamei fanim. And I mentioned there's going to be four ways he's going to explain it. We're now in the middle of the beginning of the first way. The second way will be on page 1157. And the third and fourth way of looking at it will be on page 1158. In Tzadik Dalet from the Rebbe, Friedrich Rebbe, it's going to be more elaborated upon. But he also talks about these. He just never gets to number 4 because the Hemshech of Tzadik Dalet stops after 3. But we'll get to that. So we're right now the beginning of understanding bittul from the bottom up, what the bittul of the Eid is and its perspective. So it's not just in how God looks at existence, but it's or how existence looks at existence and godliness, but it's also in the Eid itself. We have an active consciousness that's present. And the importance of it, as I could explained in the classes that we had before we had the break, was the point of it is to teach us this level of bittul. So let's sum up what this ha'aleph is. I'm reading from the middle of the top of the page, 1155, the line that begins shayr. I'm not reading inside, I'm just summing it up just to get us back up to speed. So what is it, ha'aleph? The first eifun ha'aleph of bittul ha'ir, he says, it's because it's dveikas b'mkeirei, because the light, the energy or the light is attached to its source. Harinirgush b'mkeirei, so it feels its source. It's not like the yesh. A yesh doesn't feel a source. We exist. We have to work on connecting to our source. But and I don't want to compare it to a fish in water because it's far higher than that. But it's the idea. It's margish. It's moker. And as a result of being connected, so it'd be like the student that's in the presence of his teacher. So even though he may be a great student, and he even may be a great teacher to students that are lower than him, but in the presence, when he's near and connected with, and senses his teacher, he doesn't have any tfisis mokum la'atzmei. He said no standing. He doesn't have any significance in the sense of any considering himself. Like you'll see, a truly humble person in front of his teacher will not say anything. He'll defer. He'll say, why are you turning to me? Here's my teacher. On a very balabatisha level. And he brings several different examples for this. Keser Elyon, Ucham hu kodem ilis ha'ilis. I wouldn't say examples. I should say several points that he makes here. We say Keser Elyon, even though it's Keser Elyon, it's higher than all the spheres. But Uchamhu, it's dark. It's darkened in comparison before Kodam Ilis Ilis, in the presence of the source of all sources, Ilis HaIlis, the cause of all causes, I should say. So he explains that Ucham is Shachrus, it's a darkness, it's not Eir at all. And he gives the example. And he brings the Zohar, Kol Nehurayim Mischashchoyin Kamei. All the lights are darkened compared to him, before him, because even though it's light compared to lower levels, but compared to higher levels, it's in a state of darkness, a state of total bittul. And he brings Sharaga Batira, the light of the flame of the candle in the light of in the presence of sunlight, of daylight, the bright daylight. And he brings Kamoy HaKotel Legaba Godel. So 4 things. Keser Elyon, Kol Nehurayim Mischashchoyin, like a flame in the presence of the sun, bright sunlight or daylight. And finally a cotton, or later he says a chacham cotton, a wise person in the presence of a greater wise person. And it's all, what is the bittul? Remember these words. Tfisis, she'ena tfisis mokim klal, ba'atzmei. Actually, it doesn't say klal, so raise that word. So then he goes back. Because it feels atzmos. Doesn't have any value in its own eyes because it sees something far greater than itself. Now, this is not, just for the record, this is not a negative thing. It's like a feeling in the sense where you feel like, what's the word? You don't matter. That's not the point here. The point is that, on the contrary, whatever you have doesn't have any value compared to the presence of what you're feeling and sensing. Okay. And then became a whole discussion. I'm just reviewing this again, just for, I think it's important to do. It comes with Hagam. And though this bittul, this is going to be now the presenting question in a way or analysis of this subject matter. So it begins with a Hagam, which ends up being really a question. Hagam sha'bittul dehedet v'smok shaykh legabe gili er. In other words, the whole idea of bittul would be you have a greater wise person, you have someone that's a lower stature of wisdom. He senses the gilui of the greater teacher or the greater wise person, just like the flame in the presence of the sun. So therefore, one gilui compared to a higher gilui is like a dark state, a darkened state. That makes sense. The problem here is we're talking legaba atzmus, and atzmus is not in the gather of gilui. So if you said that the oir was bottled to a higher level of oir, like keser, compared to ilus se'ilus, okay. So keser is a great light, a very powerful energy in the present. But you're talking here about oir feeling atzmus, and atzmus is beyond gilui. So what is the head of tfisas mokam exactly? What does that mean? That sums up essentially what he's asking. I'll just choose a few key lines to read just to convey this point. So he says, "Hagam shabidl de'edet v'sis mok mashayich legabe gili era kumay legabe era shemesh shabigili mizbat le'era neil." Like the light of the sun, when it's revealed, in that presence, mizbatl era neil, the light of a flame is mizbatl, is nullified. Or like a chacham gadol, kumay chacham katan shemizbatl legabe chacham gadol. But that's only because he's aware and connected with the dafke sheyedei flaws chachmas az mizbatl legabe. It's because he's aware of this great, awesome, and wondrous wisdom of the greater wise person, the chacham gadol. Therefore, he's batel, he's nullified. But if he was not aware, he wouldn't be batel. Same thing he says with Keser Elyon. Uchum hu kodem is shezeh b'chinas er hakav b'chlaus b'chinas gilead. But here's the issue. Avala atzmus harihu l'mayla b'chinas gilui. Atzmus is not like sunlight and the light of a candle. Atzmus is not like a greater wise one compared to a lower wise one. Atzmus is not like Keser Ilus compared to Keser Elyon. So how do you say headed tfisas mokim by something that's not even in your gedder even? You say headed tfisas mokim, which means it's insignificant, a lower thing in the presence of something greater. It's like one grain of sand compared to the whole beach of billions of grains of sand. But if you're talking about something that's not even made of the same matter, it's not, atzmus is not defined by gilui. So what does it mean headed tfisas mokim? That's the presenting question. So he says, Yesh Leimer. I'm reading now, middle of the page. Again, just summing this up. Yesh Leimer, the close b'chinas em n'asmas, enze b'chinas richuk min asmas. So now he introduces, I can't say it's a new idea because we already learned it. He's going to introduce the fact that even though it's true that Atzmus is beyond Oyer, and in any ways Oyer and Yesh are equally distant from Atzmus, because Atzmus is not a Mo'er, Atzmus is not closer to revelation than he is to non-revelation. In other words, Atzmus is not defined by light more, but nevertheless, when Oyer emerges, there's something about it that reflects something about Atzmus differently than what the Yesh reflects. So though, and that's what he's going to say, it's not ma'ifan of richuk. Because God, like I mentioned, and just to go refresh your memory, if you recall, if you see, if, for example, you see water coming from a brook of water, or you see light coming from the sun, it's obvious that the water reflects and expresses what the source is doing. But if you suddenly saw, let's say, the sun shining on Earth, and as a result of that, an animal began to emerge, a human being was created. You'd say, 1 second, this sun is clearly has something in it that's more than just light. So on one hand, Atzmus creates things that are not similar to him. They don't even reflect him. They don't even reveal his presence. That tells you that Atzmus is beyond anything. He's not defined by Gili. Sun and sunlight are not that way. The sun is essentially a ball of light. I should say a ball of a source of light, a luminary, a moed hagadol. It's a luminary. Just like a brook of water is made of water, the sun is a source of light, and therefore light that comes from it has some relationship with it. Atzmus is not that way. On the other hand, there are things that come from Atzmus that do reflect that there's a source. So even though he's going to say clearly that is be'ena reich to Atzmus, but it's the way it extends from Atzmus, the way it expresses itself is in the form of a gili, not in the form of a concealment. And that makes it have more of a relationship with Atzmus. So Mitzad Atzmus, Oyer is as distant as Yesh is. But Mitzad Oyer, the Oyer does have something that, because the Oyer is completely aware of the presence of its source. And therefore, it didn't conclude yet, until after the whole explanation that we're in the middle of, but he's going to ultimately explain, because of that, you could say an element of Tfisas Mokim. Because since does reveal not all of Atzmus and not the essential nature of Atzmus, but it is still nothing but an expression of its source. So that's why you can say Hed Tfisas Mokim. I don't want to explain that until we learn it inside, but that's where he's going here. So he says, Yesh Leimer, and I'm just going to sum up now till the end of the paragraph, and then we'll sum up what we learned on page 1156. So he says, Yesh Leimer, the Klolas B'chinas Mina Atzmus, I'm reading from the line, it starts Chulu, it's the middle of halfway through 1155. That the Klolas Ein Ze B'chinas Richuk Mina Atzmus. It's obviously from Atzmus. Atzmus does not have to give oyer. Atzmus is not a source of light, meaning as a moyer, has a relationship with light. But the way oyer comes from Atzmus is not in the form of a leap and distance. At the end of the day, oyer is a revelatory force. It's an expressive force. It expresses what Atzmus wants it to express. A yesh, as we're going to learn in a moment, is also creation of Atzmus. But a yesh is not, its goal is not to express and reveal Atzmus. A yesh actually is, because of its nature, it actually conceals its source. It has the purpose of Dira B'Tachtenim, and it reveals to us about some things about Atzmus that the Oyer does not. But by nature, the yesh is not a revealing force. The yesh creates a product of Atzmus, not a revelation of Atzmus. Another way of putting it. So he says like this, the Ima Yes, and again, I'm going to just select lines and just go through it quickly. The Ima Yes, even though Sha'atzmus Atzmus is not a source of light. The sun is a source for light. Its whole creation was in order L'hoyer ala Aretz, to illuminate the earth. You take away that purpose, the sun doesn't have to exist. So the sun is meant to give off light. You can't say that about Atzmus, that Atzmus is there to give us light. She says, which means Atzmus is not a source, is not an identifiable source of light. It comes from Atzmus, like everything comes from Atzmus. It's only a reflection, it's not the etzem. So it's infinitely distant. He goes on to explain how ha'ara is be'en arech klal gabe etzem ki ha'rein muhus davar asmi humus hus davar. Fine. So that would even said, even if it was oira moyer, even sunlight compared to the sun is also ein arech. But how much more so the gabe asmus is not even the gather of a moyer. It says b'frat b'chinas asmus shamuvdel be'erech legamri min ha'er. In the parenthesis he adds, to the point that from the perspective of Atzmus, Oyer is not even a gili of Atzmus. From the perspective of Oyer, Oyer, of course, is revealing. That's what its role is to reveal what Atzmus wants to express. But from the perspective of Atzmus, it's not a Gili Atzmus because Atzmus Mamish does not come in Oyer. From Oyer, you're not going to know the properties of Atzmus. Well, he says in Yiddish, was Atzmus is, wird nicht herabgetragen in Oyer. Like we learned earlier, he says, and like we learned earlier. So what do we have established from this? That on one hand, the Gabi compared to Atzmus, Oyer is be'ein arech, infinitely distant. And beyond that, it doesn't reveal the true nature of Atzmus. Mitzusim Atzmuse, for example. That Atzmus's Mitzias' existence comes from within himself. Oyer does not tell us this. Oyer talks about a source. Oyer says, I feel my source. It's an expressive energy that expresses. So that's on one hand. But then he's going to go now on the other hand. Let's see when he goes back to it. Not yet. He's continuing with this. And that's why we say, it's le'inarech. How do we learn that it's einarech legabe atzmus? We actually learn it from the yesh. We say einarech lecha be'elam hazeh. That from the yesh we learn about the einarech. Like I explained back then, when we learned for earlier classes, if you just saw Oyer Ein Sof, you would know that there is a source that gives you that from where this Oyer comes from, but you wouldn't know anything about the source. Hypothetically, if you looked at Oyer Ein Sof on its own, without any other information or data, you'd say that the Eibishter Atzmus is no different than a sun. I mean, obviously far greater, he's the creator, but light reveals that the light has a source of light. You wouldn't know about Atzmus, other elements of Atzmus that are not reflective in the light. Like I mentioned before, all you can know from sunlight is that the sun gives off light. But when you see that there's a yesh, and a yesh is unlike, and does not in any way indicate on a source, so he comes to tell you that the source is such a source that can reveal it, that can create something that doesn't reveal itself through it. That tells you that Atzmus is not just a moir, and Atzmus is be'ein arech. The me'er levad from Oyer itself lo hayinu yedim inyan ein arech ki Oyer yochli is gam leim b'chinas Atzmus. Light itself is not going to tell you necessarily things beyond what light can reveal. Light can only reveal the fact that there's a source for the light. And we see it could be also something that's not Atzmus. Sunlight gives off light, flame gives off light. So light itself does not necessarily tell you what Atzmus is like. It just tells you that where it's coming from is coming from a place that gives light. It's only from the existence of a yesh. You suddenly see this foreign entity that does not reveal anything that is even close to light. So from Metzias Yesh, Anu Yedim Inyan Ein Arech. It teaches you about the infinite distance. Like a small example, I think I gave it in the previous classes. When you see a teacher teaching wisdom to students that, yes, are not on his level, but they're commensurate. They're more or less on his level. There's something in common about them. So what does that tell you? You see a student come out of the classroom. You meet someone, a student. He tells you, my teacher, my Rebbe is so-and-so. You see from his wisdom that it reflects the wisdom of his Rebbe, which is much greater wisdom. No problem with that, absolutely. But still, what do you know about this? That this teacher has great students, that the student reveals what the teacher is like. But you only know that in the category of wisdom. For example, would you know from that the teacher is a Bal Chesed, is a kind person, that the teacher maybe does all kinds of generous acts that nobody knows about? Not necessarily. All a student can tell you about the teacher is what the student can convey, which is, I'm a student of Torah, of learning, and therefore tells you that the teacher must be a greater master of learning. You know, we talked about the example of the artist. From the art, you can know that there's an artist. but you don't know anything more about the artist. You know, is he a father? Is he a man? Is he a woman? Does he have other qualities? What is he made of? What kind of personality? So can you surmise? A few things you can learn from the art that teaches you about the artist. But things that are not communicated in Oyer, you don't know. Suddenly you see that from this creator comes something that doesn't reveal, it's not art altogether. And I mean by art as a revealing force, that art reveals the artist. You suddenly see a world that's dark, a world that does not dictate, does not indicate that there's a source. You see people, God forbid, doing things against what God wants. I'll go even a step further. I'm just to make the point. You see people defying God and ignoring and saying, I don't believe in God. You say to yourself, one second, what kind of teacher would teach a student that's telling you that the teacher doesn't exist? It's a completely, seems almost bizarre. A student showing you that I've learned from my teacher, so he's revealing to you that the teacher is a teacher. But if you suddenly see someone that has nothing in common with his source, you say, one second, oh, so Atzmus must be something completely beyond wisdom, beyond Oyer, because he creates such a helam. So the Yesh teaches you, not doesn't reveal things, but it when you use your use your mind and you put two and two together, it teaches you that Atzmus must be something completely of a different category, because he's able to create something that doesn't indicate on the source. The student can't do that. A student can only teach you about the wisdom of the teacher. So the Yesh teaches us something about the Ein Arech of Atzmus, and then you come back and say, you know what? This teacher, this student who revealed to me about his teacher, he doesn't have a clue. He also is Ein Arech to his teacher completely, because he can only tell me about the teacher's capacity to teach and his wisdom. But he doesn't at all reveal about all kinds of other things about Atzmus that are completely not expressed at all in this revealed state. So the Yesh not only does it teach us that Atzmus is beyond Oyer and beyond any definition that we can express, but he also teaches us that even Oyer, as much as it reveals, it's also equally Ein Arech. That's what he's essentially saying here. So all this is coming to tell us and make the case stronger. So how could you say Hedet Tfisas Mokim? What do you mean the earth senses the source? It only senses the light coming from the source as being a source of light, but it doesn't comprehend Atzmus. And yet we're going to learn in a moment that on the other hand, has something that does have some relationship with Atzmus that the Yesh does not have. So here's what he says. Okay, so so if you want to understand the absolute infinite distance between of Atzmus from everything, is the Yesh that teaches us that. Only an Atzmus, that Mitziasim Atzmusei and all the other Mitzias built to Mitzias Nimtza, Mechuyev Mitzias. Like we learned, Commissioners Barlil and Dibra Maskal Zayim. We learned at length about that. And from this we also know, this teaches us that the Eid is also Ein Arech. Because once you know that Atzmus is a completely different, a different caliber, a different reality, then it tells you that the Eid too, which on its own we wouldn't know, now the Eid is also Ein Arech completely compared to this Atzmus. Umamish Kamoisha Yesh. I think it's worth going over this again. Umamish Kamoisha Yesh Be'ein Arech Kamoy Ken Gama Eru Be'ein Arech. Mamish. And they just exactly like the Yesh is Ein Arech, infinitely distant, same thing with Oyer. So based on this, Oyer and Yesh are completely equal in the eyes of God, the eyes of Atzmus.
I'm not sure why that's mufrach.
What do you mean? I just explained to you that because once you know that Atzmus is not defined by Oyer, so then Oyer has no advantage. What Oyer is just another, just like, God creates a stone, he creates a tree, and he creates Oyer. It's all coming from something that's infinitely distant from all of them. Because God can't be split into two.
No, but
Without
can't we say
Yesh,
that?
you wouldn't know that. The Yesh tells you that everything, that Atzmus is completely, you wouldn't know that Atzmus is built in Metzias Nimtza and Metzias Atzmuse from Oyer. So once you do know that, then you realize, you know what? Oyer is as equally distant from Metzias Atzmuse as Yesh is, like we learned. Because Oyer also has a source. Everything has a source except Atzmus. So the Yesh teaches us that also Oyer is infinitely distant from Metzias Atzmuse.
Good, thank you. That was good. Thank you.
Okay, but now comes the second half.
Still not explaining why the oil is having a header tfisa smoking.
We didn't get to that yet. That's as I said, he doesn't answer that till page 1157. He's first analyzing the two different angles. Just you have to bear, it's not going to be answered right now. But now comes the second half, which is equally important. Because based on this, you can ask a different question before I continue. I could say, so then what do we need Oyer for? What does Oyer accomplish? If Oyer is equally distant and from Atzmus as Yesh is, so what role does it play? You understand there's another side to this, which is we're gonna read now. And then we're gonna go back and talk about the head of Tfisas Makom. So just be patient, that's all, because what we're in the middle of comes down to explain the whole thing with Rotzen and Koiches. We didn't even get to that yet. I'm just trying to get it back to, I think it's vital that we do this because we will not understand this whole subject unless we get back to the core elements of what's being discussed here. Okay.
Rabbi Jacobson, we're learning that Yesh, the Yesh doesn't have the Ein Arok Lamgamre Le'elakus La'atzmus, but we learn in Torah that I think this, that we're B'Tselem Elokim, that we are in the image of God. So doesn't that show that we do have a shaychus and a be'erech godliness? Or are you going to say that Elokus, when it says B'Tselem Elokim, we're talking about a lower level, and that's not referring to Atzmus?
That's answer number one. That as soon as you say Tselem Elokim, you're talking about Atzilus. You're not talking about Atzmus. Mm-hmm. We're not creating the image of Atzmus. We're creating the image of the way Atzmus manifested in the Esesphiris of the Adam Elyon.
Okay.
So that's number one. That's number one. But number two, which is maybe even more important, is this. Remember, this is how it is in its essential nature. We're not even talking now. What the fact is, Atzmus, however, Nesava Kadosh Baruch Hu liyisle dira b'tachtein. He had a desire for dira b'tachtein, and he then chose to have a relationship with us. Here we're talking about, if you want to talk about pure firepower, so to speak, comparing Atzmus to anything else, there's only one reality, Atzmus. But then, as we've been talking many times, once you talk about the kavanah, that God says, and now I, Atzmus, want to create an existence. Forget about what the reason is. It's a taiva, there's no reason. And then he says, I want a relationship. So this is not one that creates a commonality, but once Atzmus chooses that, he has the ability to in some way say, you can connect with me through doing ABC, through doing mitzvahs, through building a mishkan, and so on. We'll talk about that, but that's already coming. That's not Atzmus. If you talk about Atzmus, the nature of Atzmus, Kavyachal, the so to speak identity of Atzmus compared to the identity of existence, Ein Arech. But then there is absolutely, he wants a yesh, and he wants the yesh to work. And through Aveda, we can connect. Remember, Aveda does create the relationship. So if you talk without Aveda, without the Kavona, Atzmus is infinitely distant. But you have to remember as well, even through Aveda, what is the Aveda ultimately? That we recognize the Ein Arech. Remember, when we recognize that Atzmus is completely beyond us, that itself creates a relationship. It's a realistic relationship. It's, just to I'll give an example from marriage. If you think you have your spouse figured out, then you really don't have a full relationship. When you realize there's a mystique and there's a mystery to the fact that a spouse is different than you are and has, I don't say secrets, but has elements that you may never fully understand, that actually creates a deeper relationship, not a more different, it doesn't create distance, it creates more closeness, because the realistic fact is Atzmus is Atzmus. We're not Atzmus. So if we try to say, you know what, I'm created B'Tselem Elokim, and you and I, let's go out for lunch because we're like partners, the response to that, yes, I chose you to be my partner, but I didn't tell you that you're suddenly God. God remains God. And though, yes, in many ways we speak the language, God is accountable to us as we're accountable to him, and we can complain and we can demand and we want Mashiach now. Yes, but that's because God allowed that and invited us in there. But no one should ever suddenly come to realize and say, you know what, I'm me and God, we're equals. Hey, he told me I'm a shutef l'Kadosh Baruch Hu b'ma'aseh b'reishis. He made me a partner. The joke they tell about the guy, this wealthy man, marries off his daughter, and he loves his son-in-law, and he says to the son-in-law, listen, I'm going to make you a partner in my business. And that's that. So find yourself a position you like. So the son-in-law comes to the plant and to the company and starts looking. You want to be in the accounting department? No. You want to be in the production department? No. Marketing? No. What do you want to be? He says, the truth is, I don't like any of these jobs. So his father-in-law tells him, 1 second, I made you a partner, but now you have to do something for this. He says, you know what? Since you made me a partner, why don't you buy me out? So the point that I'm making here is that, yes, God made us a partner, but that's not what that does not mean that suddenly we replace, God forbid, God. And part of the partnership is our respect and understanding that Atzmus is always Atzmus. So the point is, yes, at the end of the day, the whole Ayin Beis, all of Torah Chassidus is to teach us how to have a relationship with God. But a relationship with God is not so simple. You're talking about beyond infinite and finite, beyond the immortal and the mortal, beyond everything and structured existence, which is, of course, is the biggest paradox and dilemma. That's why we need Torah and Chassidus and Ayin Beis especially. How do you create a commonality of such, Atzmus is incomparable. Even Oyer we're learning, nothing compares. And yet, the whole other side of the coin is that, and yet Atzmus wants to have a relationship with us. And that relationship has to be an honest one, which means we understand on one hand that only Atzmus is Mitziusi Matzmuse. And in some mysterious way, he is conveying and giving over some of that to us to connect with him. So I think you need to always have this balance of bittul, which is a certain element of yira, Kabbalah soil, yira shamayim, recognizing God is beyond us, and at the same time, kiruv, avas Hashem, relating, emulating God's ways. And I think it really comes down to, you can't mix the two because they're both necessary in a healthy relationship. So that's just brief. I've talked about this many, many times, but it's worth repeating because it's something that keeps coming up. And you have to always know it's going to be a dance between an ein arech, which means completely beyond, but then a relationship. Look, Shlomo Melech says to Hashem, Shemayim v'shmei Shemayim lo yichal kalucha. The heavens and the heaven of the heavens can't contain you. Af ki abayis hazeh? How is this small little box, this small little home, sanctuary, the Mishkan, the Mikdash, the Beis HaMikdash is going to contain you? If heavens and heaven of heavens, all the universe, all the cosmos can't contain you, how is a Mishkan, a Beis HaMikdash of a certain measurement going to contain you? And the Eibishter responds, he says, what you're saying in a question is the answer. It's true, heaven and heavens can't contain me, but I want to be here with you in this Beis HaMikdash, and I have the power to allow yourself to allow you to capture and in many ways experience me through this small structure that you're building. Or if you want to put it like you said, Tselem Elokim, through the human being, v'shachanti b'seicham. But that doesn't mean that Atzmus has suddenly limited himself and he's no longer Atzmus. It means this Atzmus that is completely beyond, in some mysterious way, and when you learn Chassidus, the more you learn, the more you begin to understand it, can be with us, just like he's completely apart from us, he also has the power to be with us. And ultimately, for us to relate to that, we need our Aveda, because without Aveda, it won't work. Because as I said many times, God can't impose himself on us. He could say, here are the methods, the methodologies. Here are the stepping stones. Here's the whole Seder Shtalshalos. You climb the ladder step by step by step. Connect with me. B'chol avavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meidecha, Torah, Aveda, Gemilas Chasodim, the Yom Tevim. These are the tools, the stepping stones for the journey. Do your part, and I will do my part, and we will meet. It's exactly what happened by Matan Torah. We meet. It's a marriage. Moshe goes up on the mountain. Hashem comes down. Kav Yachal. Mashiach and Geula is when there'll be the total fusion of the two. So it's vital, and I'm just saying it's critical. You have to, when you speak about this topic, you can't just talk about it all in one sentence. You have to first establish Atzmus is Atzmus. There's only one God. Hashem Echad, period. That never changes. Ashnei Hashem Leishanisi, like we learned. And then there's what God wants and what God desires. And he sets into motion a whole series of events and Eid Ein Sof, and we learned the whole process, and then a Tzimtzum and a Kav and Ak and the Elamis and all that. Now begins another step. Once Adam and Chava put in the Gan Eden, now we got a job to do. We have to refine the world. We're given a job. We're partners. And it's a constant process of recognizing Ava and Yira, Richuk and Kiruv, Einarech, and closeness. And it's all part of it. So when you just talk about it, you just have to know which part are you talking about. Because they're not a contradiction. It's just pieces of a puzzle. And sometimes you read, the Alter Rebbe, when he said the word Atzilus, he would tremble. Let alone we're talking about Lifnei Atzimtzum and levels like these levels we're talking about. We don't tremble because for us it's words. But if you start to experience and relate to something that is what's called Kedusha, holiness, you don't even need to go all the way up to these high levels to realize that there's something to be in awe of. It's really beyond us. And the gift is that something so beyond chose to be with us. I mean, I'm just, again, summing up what we've spoken many times, and you just have to...
Can I ask a follow-up question? It's fascinating. You said before we took our break here that there are some Makubalim and maybe even great Hasidic masters that held that we could not reach this level. The highest level of having an intimate relationship with God is halavai to the world of Atzilus. We couldn't reach or Ein Sof Lifnei Atzimtzum, not even close to Atzmus. Would you say that after the revelation of Ayin Beis and Chabad Hasidus, that it's accepted that the radical notion among many that we can have a relationship with Atzmus, this Ein Aruch, can be bridged? Would you say that that's now after the revelation of Ayin Beis in specific, that would be accepted by everybody in the world, even in Gan Eden Elyon, as with the Ramak and everybody is accepting that we can go that high? Or are there people that still say, this is a Shita, but I still don't feel that we can reach this unbridgeable chasm?
Okay, let me say a few points. I know this is somewhat, your question is a good question, and I can't say it's pshat here in these pages in Ayin Beis, but it is relevant to the whole picture. So I'll say a few words about it, unless people want me to continue with the pshat here. But so I'll just say the following. A few things. First of all, halavai, people would even be talking about it and say there's different shittas. In an ironic way, Chassidus itself, that teaches about these highest levels, revealed to us about the different levels of the other Mukabolim. I can't say there's a community I know of today in the world that says, no, we don't go by Chassidus Chabad because we can't reach Atzmus, we can only reach Atzilus. I would love to visit that community and see how well they're doing. I think that what I would look at it is more like the evolution of Torah. It's like asking, once upon a time we only had Mishnah, then we had Gemara, then we had Rabbanon Savaroi, and then we had Goinim, and we had Rishenim and Achronim, and I include everybody, Rambam and Rashi, and all the way to today. So if someone were to ask, 1 second, what do we have today that the Tanoim didn't have? The answer is, Nonas al Gaba Anok, we're like midgets on the shoulders of giants. It's one accumulative story. It began in the beginning of creation. There's a major event happened in Matan Torah. The Torah continued to, let's call it, evolve, obviously according to the guidelines of the Gimel Yud Gimel Midrash Torah and the Dreshes Behem and so on, the methodologies established at Matan Torah. And now, when we learn Torah today, we have the whole picture. See, and you have the different machlekes. You have Shammai's opinion, Hillel's opinion. What we have, the benefit is we see all the opinions, we see how they've been explained by each generation, and we have a much bigger picture. The same thing I would say with Chassidus.
And then in all those days, each elaboration, like from going to Mishnah and Talmud, is because we became weaker. We need more explanations that were present in the original.
That's one hand. We need more because it's darker. Another side of it is we get closer to Mashiach, we have more revelation as well. But the point I want to make is that it goes deeper than it's not just different opinions. When you know the opinion of the Arizal and the Ramak and the Mareches and the Shittas Rakanti, I'm just giving you some of the Mukabolim, or the Rameh Mipane, the different opinions of how high you can reach. Can it be integrated into our being? Because remember, the opinions go two ways. You can reach the highest, but you have to essentially be dissolved in it, and therefore don't have your identity. On the other hand, you want your identity, you can't reach the highest. All these pieces, the way you learn them in Chassidus, they actually become critical. Like, for example, you say the Rambam and the Ramban, famous machlekes, the ultimate reward, will it be Gan Eden only for neshamas or also for neshamas begufim? The body is tchias hamesim. So everybody knows there has to be tchias hamesim. The question is, what will be the permanent reality? So the Rambam says, a body could never experience spirituality and the divine like a soul. Therefore, there'll be a stage where the body is rewarded for its avodah. But then it will be souls. Then comes the Ramban, disagrees that the ultimate reward is neshamas begufim. The Mukabolim, and especially the Alter Rebbe, as the Tzemach Tzedek says, all follow the Ramban. This doesn't suddenly make the Rambam meaningless. No, there's value in what he's saying, because from the point of view of, let's say, Giluyim and revelation, there's something about the Rambam's statement that we need to know. So the way we really learn Torah is that even when there's a disagreement, there's first of all, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim, each one has some merit and virtue, and we need to know Shammai's opinion, even though the halacha is like Hillel. Secondly, they all add to each other, because the Rambam is speaking up. He's Seichel, Alpi Ruchnius. Atzilus always has a superiority over Bria. But then there's also the element, the mile of the Yesh, the mile of Tachtenim, and so on. My point is that, yes, today, when you see Chassidus, don't look at Chassidus as, another opinion. Chassidus has taken all these opinions and reached deeper and higher. And you could probably say, as was mentioned, that as we go along in history, it could be that the day of Moshe Rabbeinu, for them, Atzilus was enough. And once they pioneered and paved the way, the later generations start bringing Elokus. Let's talk even simply, the Alter Rebbe. What did the Alter Rebbe do? He went to reach Goyim? No. Most Jews were religious. He couldn't reach most people. There was no technology. The Rebbe's of their Ashvi can't even be compared. The idea of a shlichus. But if you know, the philosophy is the same philosophy. It was just in the time of the Alter Rebbe, the reach was a certain place. Then the reach expanded. Even in the Rebbe's own leadership, as I've pointed out many times, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, very different. Same Rebbe, same mission, but like concentric circles. Think of it like a Lahavdla company that's slowly capturing the market. First, you capture the market as the low-hanging fruit around you. You expand, you expand, you expand, until you conquer the whole world with Elokus. So if you look in history, that's exactly the whole point. When you see how each Rebbe added to the previous Rebbe before him, you see exactly that. The Alter Rebbe said already, "Mili b'shamayim kim chalei chafatzti." that I don't want Gan Eden, you're Gan Eden, and you're Elam Haba, and Gan Eden, Atach, Gan Eden, Elam Haba. I want you alone. But you know what? We appreciate that line a lot more today once you learn through Chassidus, and especially you learn Ayin Beis. So yes, it's basically a process of continuing growth in this direction. And when you come down to it, all the previous opinions happen to be the building blocks that upon which you build and you go higher and higher. And it really never ends because the connection we have with Ein Sof does never come to an end. There's no retirement. Mashiach comes, we'll continue to grow in our relationship. It's really a bigger topic, but that's the brief response to it.
You said it so beautiful, Simon. You said it very, very clear and beautiful. I don't know if I'm right, but I think, and I am, that even the Ramak, for example, after the Gilui from the Arizal, he would also agree with that. The Arizal revealed a new way. So after this revelation, I think so, no?
I agree. Look, the Rebbe brings with the Rambam, famous Rambam, Shuvas Rambam, Igeres Rambam, where the Chachmei Lunil, whoever from France, wrote to him, they criticized the Rambam for not mentioning Tchias HaMesim in Sefer Mishneh Torah. If you look in the last two prakim, there's not mention of Tchias HaMesim. We talks about Mashiach and Geula. There's no mention of Tchias HaMesim. We say it every day in davening. He mentions it in Hilchas Tshuva almost tangentially. He says, someone who doesn't believe in Tchias HaMesim is a kafir, a kafir be'ikr.
And then Yud Gimel Ikorim, Ani Ma'amin be'emunah shlema b'tchias hamesim. That's a Rambam.
I'm talking about in the Sefer Halachas, Mishneh Torah. No mention made in Perek Yud Aleph and Perek Yud Beis about Tchias HaMesim. So he responded to them. The Rebbe brings this often, that what he wrote in the Sefer Halachas were the things that he definitely found to be definite halacha. The things that he did not find clear, he left, didn't say he's against it, he just didn't put it in there. But if should there be a source that identifies that you have to put that in, he would agree. So the Rebbe brings that once the Rambam says that, that means once Tchias HaMesim is explained by Gdelim afterwards, what kind of foundation that is. And the Rambam himself, as you just pointed out, the Yud Gimel Ikrim says so, the Rambam would agree. So my point is yes, my answer is yes. The Ramak, once you see, look, if you had all the Mukabolim right now with us, and they saw what Chassidus taught, of course they have Simcha Gdela, because number one, they see how Chassidus built upon them, and number two, they see the whole truth of the whole picture. Just like you think of the Tanoim, look at the Gemara, or they look at Rishenim and Achreinim, they only have, not, as long as it's mechuvan, and it's aligned with what Torah wants, for them is the greatest simcha. You know the story with Moshe Rabbeinu and Rabbi Akiva, the Gemara says, he saw Rabbi Akiva teaching, he was so nispal, he was so humbled, he says to Hashem, why did you give the Torah to me? You should have given it to him. He saw Rabbi Akiva teaching secrets that Moshe himself never knew. So the Eibishter tells him, continue listening. So one of the students asked Rabbi Akiva, where does this come from? What's your source? He says, Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So then it says, Noch daite, that Moshe, so to speak, was pacified, was calmed down. So the Rebbe once asked the question, 1 second, does Moshe Rabbeinu, he needs the credit? Suddenly, so the Rebbe said, interesting answer, the Rebbe said, when Rabbi Akiva said his Kedushim, he was very taken by it, and he was wondering. Once Rabbi Akiva said, Halacha l'Moshe Sinai, he says, he saw Rabbi Akiva said he has a Rebbe. It wasn't about Moshe. He has a Rebbe. So he realized it's all coming from the generations before. So there's no question that as Torah continues to be clarified, how would Rashi feel if he learned the Rebbe's Sichos in explaining Rashi? There are many things I'm sure Rashi consciously was not necessarily aware of, but his words are Divrei Torah. And the same thing, what does David HaMelech feel when we say Tehillim, when a person in a sincere and authentic way cries with a kapitel Tehillim? You achieve things that even David HaMelech may not have been aware of. Bottom line is it's one big picture, and there's no question that when we all come together after Mashiach comes, there'll be tremendous nachas and appreciation of how Torah evolve from generation to generation, and the previous generations will see all the Giluyim that came out from what they first established. There's no question about that. That's the whole...
And בפרט, the Teres Baal Shem Tov, Teres Chassidus, the Achona for Mashiach. So this is the summary from everything.
Look, and when he writes Rabbi Yehuda Kohen, what does he write? He writes that he Teres Baal Shem Tov. And I'm sorry, no, he writes Ata Yismach Yisrael. The Rebbe Rashab says he Teres Baal Shem Tov.
But Rabbi Jacobson, if right now, if the Rambam and Ramban are talking, I'm not sure that he would say, I agree with your Shita. He would say, I understand it's possible, but we haven't had Techias HaMeisim yet, so it might be that my Shita is correct. And he wouldn't be masking that you've established beyond a shadow of a doubt that your Shita is correct. And my question to you, which you're fascinating answer, but my question to you is that has it been, since we haven't reached this level of being able to bridge Atmos that the Ayin Beis is going into so deeply and so profoundly and so miraculously, we haven't been able to really achieve that, right? So it's not necessarily established as halach l'Moshe Misinai that this is accepted as this is definitely possible until it happens. Or you're going to say that no, this revelation of Hasidus Chabad in Ayin Beis is so deep and so profound, and it's actually been revealed already, that truth has been accepted and revealed? Or do we have to wait till we can achieve that level?
Look, I'm sure when Shammai and Hillel disagreed, and it was L'Shem Shamayim, that Shammai appreciated Hillel's opinion, Hillel appreciated Shammai's opinion, and they understood that the world of Chesed, Hillel is correct, the world of Gvura, Shammai is correct. And then there comes a time for halacha, a psak halacha, which has to be one way, not the other. It says that Mashiach comes, the halacha will be like Shammai. It says that now Talmud Gadol Shemei V'Lidei Maisa, when Mashiach comes, Maisa Gadol. So you have to understand Torah on all its levels. Every piece of Torah is true. Even the things that Rebbe's father writes, even the things that the Gemara calls shibdusa, which means foolish, is also part of Torah. Even the psukim in Chumash that talk about the children of Yishmael or of Rishayim and people who are completely against what Yiddishkeit stands for are also part of Torah. So I think you have to look at it in two different ways. You're talking about the practical halacha, ein mikri yetzim de pshute, the halacha, what you're supposed to do. So obviously there's one way to go, which is the psak. But the emes of all these dimensions are there. And when you learn it, you see the whole picture. And one supports the other, even when there's a complete contradiction. In other words, even if the Rambam and the Ramban disagree, when we look at it, each of them is speaking about a certain level, and there's a truth to that level. The Rambam wasn't wrong in his theory, maybe wrong in B'Poel Mamish, because by bottom line, Olam Haza has its value. But there's much to learn from the Rambam's approach, which is not a discussion for right now. Same thing with when you talk about the different opinions of the Mukabolim. If you really learn them properly, they actually help understand Chassidus, and Chassidus helps understand them. So it's not at all like which opinion we go by. They all are part of the whole story, and they all are necessary. There's the famous disagreement about the Oir. Is Oir mitsuyarim or pshutim? Is Oir seamless and shapeless? Does it have particles? Chassidus says both are true, even though those Mekabolim disagreed. When you read their Svarim, you'll say one says what he writes, I don't agree with. Chassidus says both are true. One is the Pnimius Ha'er, one is Chitzenius Ha'er, Pnimius Ha'kav, Chitzenius Ha'kav. So then, at the end of the day, each has something to teach us, and we need to know both opinions, especially when you're talking Ruchnius. You're talking Halacha, obviously you either make the bracha on Lulav and Esrog a certain way or another way. But in the conceptual, the methodologies, and especially the spiritual side, each one has its qualities. Again, this is a longer discussion. I'm not going to go into it right now in detail.
Allow me just to add one more thing, that Eliezer said that the Rambam did not change his mind. But according to what Chassidus is explaining, that in the Guf, is there yesh or amiti? Why did the Rambam say there's no Tchias HaMeisim? Because a goof cannot tolerate it. But after this was Nisgale, that Davke Bagashmi, Bayesh Agashmi is the Gilui of Atzmus. So then Tchias HaMeisim, Nishamis Begufim, is a higher than Nishamis Bligufim.
It's very possible that Rambam learned Chassidus, and I'm sure he's learning it now. He may say, he may change his opinion. But his opinion that he had still stands. It's still a Torah opinion. Remember, the fact that it's not the psak like that doesn't make it not a Torah opinion. There's a reason, there's a logic in the Rambam's approach. When you look from the perspective of Atzilus, for example, the Rambam's approach is more correct than the Ramban's approach. If you look at the whole Seder Shtalshlus, it's not that way. That's all I'm saying. Okay. It's like saying, which is greater, tzaddikim or Baalei Tshuva? In some places it says this is greater, sometimes this is greater. Each one in their department, so to speak, their area. Let's stop here because Atkan Akof Aleph, or whatever you want to call it. What I didn't finish here is the other side of the coin, and we'll do that tomorrow. What about, so even though and Yesh are completely equally distant from Atzmus, infinitely distant, nevertheless, he's going to say that there's a different, that how emerges from Atzmus and how other things emerge are different. And that's going to be the reason that there's some type of, I don't like to use the word commonality, but something about that's unique. And we'll continue tomorrow.
This is still not clear.
Well, middle of talking, yeah. We're in the middle of it, yeah.
Shkoyach, thank you so much, enlightening.